Welcome to the Heal, Thrive, Dream podcast, where trauma survivors become healthy thrivers. Each month, we'll feature a theme in the trauma recovery and empowerment field. To promote your recovery, healing, and learning how to build dreams, here's your host, Karen Robinson, transformational coach and therapist.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Heal, Thrive, Dream. Our guest today is Dr. Cindy Bigby. Dr. Bigby is America's communication coach. She is the president of Bigby Method, and she calls that TBN, the Biggie Method, an award-winning trainer, consultant, and speaker. She created the Bigby Method to address America's trauma epidemic. Dr. Bigby has dedicated her career to bringing restorative practices and nonviolent communication to all segments of society. In 2019, she won the Dennis Maloney Award for Youth-Based Community and Restorative Justice Programs from the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice. She holds a PhD in Instructional Systems Design from Florida State University. Her newly published book, My Link to Mildred, Interrupting the Epidemic of Trauma via Nonviolent Communication, and has been designated an Amazon bestseller. So thank you, Dr. Bigby, for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about the book.
Of course you are. It's a big deal. It's we were talking before airing. It's your baby. It's your movement, your purpose, and it's a beautiful one. You know, anything that makes the world a better place. I guess I read this in the book, but obviously people don't have your book yet. Maybe somebody does that's listening. Hopefully, if they don't have it yet, that they'll go and purchase. But tell us, how did you decide that what would be really helpful in stopping the epidemic is nonviolent communication? Like, how did you get there?
Oh gosh, there's a long story behind that.
The condensed version.
The condensed version. Well, I think on a personal level, I grew up with trauma. And I came up with, the name of the book is My Link to Mildred. Here's a copy of it right here. And I had the title for 25 years because I realized about 25 years ago, one day I was like, I can totally trace my own quote crazy. Like I can see how it was handed down from, what happened to my great grandmother, and then what happened to, my grandfather as a result, and then my mother, and then me. It was like, man, I can see the way that it plays out in my interactions. So, I came up with the name of the book, My Link to Mildred, who was my great grandmother, by like looking at the history of trauma passed down through the ages. And then I happened to be blessed to come into knowing nonviolent communication, I don't even know, probably 15 years or so ago, and have owned it and learned it and used it and ran a program with it as the backbone, seeing like, wow, how powerful it is just with people, but also living it myself, right? So living it and seeing the way that it played out, in particular in my own relationships and in the way that I move in the world, how helpful it's been. So that's a quick answer to your question.
That was great, because it kind of divides us in two areas too. So, what sort of traumas would you say that your ancestors have that are pretty significant that helped you do this link?
Well, my great grandmother came from Russia, Poland, where they were more or less thrown out of the country because of their Jewish heritage. Like, you're going to die or get out of here. So
right.
There was that trauma. And she came over to the United States when she was 11 by herself. So she lost her family, her ties to her family. So that was traumatic. My grandfather, her son, was abused, physically abused, because he grew up often in an orphanage because she was working in the factories around the clock. So in those days, because she couldn't be with her children, they were put into a turn of the century orphanage and used to be beat up. If he would run away, he would come back and get beat up. So he had physical abuse. And then when he had my mom, he had all that anger pent up in him and, didn't know the first thing really about having a family and, how do you deal with stuff when it comes up. So he was physically abusive to my mother, physically and verbally abusive to my mom. Grew up, I write in the chapter in the book how when she was a baby, her parents literally fed her vomit because they were frustrated and didn't know. So that was kind of the abuse handed down through the centuries. And then my mom, she didn't beat us, but there was a lot of what I would call verbal abuse. Yeah.
So she did try to do a little better, but she had a lot of struggles of her own to overcome.
Yeah, she definitely did better. And I do think that every generation has the potential to improve upon the last.
Thank goodness.
Yeah.
Thank goodness.
Yeah.
There's hope.
I do believe that there's really a lot of truth. No, she was pretty aware. She had a lot of awareness, but she had a lot of very built-in programming. It's hard to undo it. And so nothing, I think she definitely didn't give to us what she was given, thankfully. But, in the book, I also talk about how even, biologically, if it's not handed down, environmentally, there's so much research now that just shows that even genetically, it's built into our systems, more than likely actually as a protection mechanism, weirdly. But, it's hard to
keep ourselves safe.
Correct. Yeah.
And we call that epigenetics. Is that the word that you're thinking of in terms of is our transgenerational trauma?
Right.
In our cells and our DNA. Yeah.
And one of the main things that I really wanted to get across in the book, there's many points, but that I'm actually fortunate because I can trace the lineage of my trauma. It helps when you can put it in context. You can see the way that you're moving in the world and the way that you're interacting and have explanations for it. But there's so many parts of our society, there's so many segments of our society where people don't have that understanding or knowledge. It's called decontextualized trauma, right? Where, you're showing up in a certain way. Like if you think about, African-American population, so much of what happened in slavery was so traumatic, and yet families were torn apart, and many people have no idea about the lineage that was handed down, right? Still playing out in us in a way. And that's called decontextualized trauma. And I want to give a lot of attention to that because I think that that's very much in play in our daily interactions without even having an awareness of it.
I agree. And that's where the nonviolent communication, I think, is huge. But before we jump over to that, I wanted to say one of the beautiful pieces of the book, in my opinion, is how understanding your family's historical trauma, you seem to have, I should say, I'll let you decide if you have it or not. You seem to have loads of compassion for your mom. That doesn't mean that you had always had patience for her because, you're human, but you seem to have a lot of compassion for her. What would you say about that?
Yeah, well, the book, my mother asked me to write the book when she was dying. She died a little bit over a year ago. It came out of nowhere. We didn't see it coming. My mom seemed perfectly fine, healthy. And then next thing you know, she had stage 4 lung cancer and died within a month. And as she was dying, she asked for me to write the book because she and I were fully aware of the way trauma played out for us, and then how the nonviolent communication has been so huge in the way that she and I have been able to communicate and be with one another. It gave us major potential to have healing with one another and real honest conversations and hard conversations. I think it's very rare, you probably could speak to this, where people get the opportunity that the person that imparted the harm to you is able to say, I'm sorry, and really mean it and take ownership of it. And I had that with my mom. Thanks to nonviolent communication, thanks to the way that we learned how to communicate and hear one another. In the last year of my mother's life, we had some really intense, beautiful conversations where my mom just really got very deeply how some of her behaviors affected me and left an imprint. And she was really devastated by that and was able to share that with me. And yeah, so I think for largely due to knowing nonviolent communication and having a different way of being with someone and hearing each other, my mom and I had a lot of healing in our relationship in the end. And I'm so grateful for that, because it would have been hard to have her pass with any of those things not healed.
Yeah, it would have felt like the grief would have been way more complicated. I know it's probably still complicated, but way more complicated if you didn't have that piece. One of my favorite scenes is the yoga at the cemetery. Can you tell us more about how you got the idea to do that?
Well, I've been doing yoga for a long time. It's definitely a part of my morning practice. And so it's just something I do every day anyways. And yeah, it just seemed like a really sweet thing to do, to go there in the morning and be with her in that way. And I did it. My mom died on May 5th, which was a Thursday. And then we buried her Friday, very next day. And Saturday, I think I stayed in bed the entire day. And Sunday was Mother's Day. And that's when I first went to the cemetery after we had buried her. And that was the first time that I ever did yoga there. But I do it, I still do it. I'll still go out there in the morning, bring my yoga mat. And it's so sweet. It's just such a sweet thing to be able to just lay there right next to her on the earth. It's comforting, which is very surprising to me. Like, I really thought it would be scary initially when I went there, but still, initially and even now, there's something very comforting about laying on the earth right there where my mom is, Not scary at all.
Yeah.
I find it to be very beautiful.
Yeah. And it didn't sound like her transition was scary either. It sounded peaceful. Would you agree with that?
Her transition is still mind-boggling to me in a good way. Like I said, my mom came here she didn't live here. I'm in Tallahassee. She lived down in South Florida. She had a pain in her neck that she was really complaining about and couldn't get any attention. So I had her come up here, and that was on April 1st. And then she died May 5th. So it was literally 1 month where everything happened so fast. For her, she didn't seem scared at all the whole way through it. It was crazy to see her bravery and openness and acceptance to it all. She even, I know I mentioned this in the book at one point near the very end, like the last couple of days, she said, "This is an amazing experience." Like, that's literally what she said. "This is an amazing experience." And yeah, I think my mom did a lot of spiritual work through her whole life. And I guess she was just in acceptance. She really didn't, every step of the way, this is what she would just kind of, when she found out she had, something fluid in her lungs, she just kind of shrugged her shoulder. When she found out she had cancer, stage 4, there was going to be no treatment for it. It was just, she seemed okay, which was also a blessing, because I talk a lot nowadays how I've been really so fine since my mom passed. Again, I think that's got to do with we had so much closure, and she was okay with the dying. There's very few places in our society where you can have a mother die and it's okay to be okay. right? Like, I mean, that's not a typical thing. You usually hear so many other things, but it was a very beautiful experience. My mother's passing was a beautiful experience. Yeah. And I'm grateful. I'm grateful that it was that way for her. I'm grateful it was that way in my experience of it.
Yeah. Well, it's the way you described it in the book. It did seem very beautiful. It really did. So, yeah, I can appreciate that you have gratitude for that.
Yeah, there was so much time. There was so much time to just, we laughed. We spent so much time together. My whole family spent so much time together. It was really beautiful. I mean, there were some really heartbreaking, sad moments, but there was a beauty there all the way through it as well.
Yeah. So switching back to your life's work, your purpose, remind me who the founder of Nonviolent Communication is again. His name's escaping me.
Dr. Marshall Rosenberg.
Okay, Dr. Rosenberg, you actually got to work with him, is that right?
Well, I trained with him years and years ago. He used to do, and the Center for Nonviolent Communication still does do these 9-day intensive trainings. He was the one that started the 9-day intensive trainings where he would do all over the world. So I was fortunate enough before he passed to do a 9-day intensive training with him.
And you adapted his training, based on your experience of teaching it for a while. And so tell us, I don't know how succinct you can be, but how did you get it to really work well with the disenfranchised populations?
Yeah, so I was very fortunate to get to run a restorative justice program here for close to 10 years. And I worked with kids that were ages 13 to 17, most of whom were referred to us because they were involved in our legal system, like they had broken the law. So some really, quote, hard kids, right? And what we did in the restorative justice program mostly was teach and model and live this nonviolent communication process. And how I got it to work was every step of the way, it's been just like trial and error. When I first started in the program, it was hard because nonviolent communication, NVC for short, is really about power sharing. That whenever it's based on this idea that whenever there is conflict, it's because there's an imbalance of power of some sort, right? And so these kids that are coming in and showing up, so much of their life is in turmoil because of power imbalances that they've been working with, or dealing with their entire life. Now they're asked to go to this program, so they're pissed off coming in to begin with, right? And here I am trying to teach this whole process that's really more about sharing power, right? So it was very difficult at first. At my very first day, I think I wrote in the book about how on the first day when they came in and I said, well, if you don't want to be here, I'm not into forcing anybody on anything, you can leave. And the entire class basically got up and left. And then I went home and
wrong question.
A few of them came back because they felt bad for me. Honestly, like the whole class left. No, this is no exaggeration. I went home and I cried to my husband. I was like, this isn't going to work. This isn't going to work. And then I started thinking, well, I've taught a lot of adults in my community, NVC. What if I call my village and ask people to show up? And then if I have enough adults in the group, and I start to break them up into dyads, because I literally teach empathy with NVC. We teach a process of empathy in breaking people into dyads to give and receive empathy. So I asked people to show up, and I had enough people show up. So I ended up with this 1-to-1 ratio of kids to adults in my community. And then when I was teaching the NVC process, when I would break them into dyads, I'd have a kid and a grown-up, and one would give, the other would receive empathy, and then they would switch. And it was like magic. It really was magic.
It sounded magical. Yeah.
Just like, I still to this day wish that I could videotape or get the kids' faces before and after being heard in a deep way. Just being able,
because it was their first time. right?
probably in their whole entire life where
Mhm.
somebody just heard them, truly just heard them with no judgment. So that's kind of at the crux of NVC, is being able to hear and speak without judgment, which is a very big deal. Like, there's so much judgment in our conversation without us having even awareness of it. And for people that have had trauma, which is most of us, we need safety, emotional safety. In order to have emotional safety when we're talking back and forth, we need to be able to take the judgment out of the way that we're communicating. But yet there's so much judgment, just even in very benign things that we say to one another, there's usually judgment there. So yes, so for these kids, it was quite miraculous to see them receive being heard in a way like that. Does that answer your
It,
question?
Beautifully. Absolutely. Yeah. I was thinking too that, I've been a therapist a long time now. And at the beginning of my career, when working with someone out of control, there was, takedowns and holds, and it never felt good. It was definitely power over. And then later in my career, the nonviolent communication piece would come in. And it's just so beautiful how just listening with your two ears and a few simple words could totally de-escalate someone that's hurting.
Yeah,
It's just amazing.
it
So we don't
is.
have to run to them and inject them with something, or run to them and tie them up, or,
Oh, I know.
hold them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I have some teachers now that here in Florida, we call it like exceptional education, for kids that they have behavioral issues, right? And they're trained to do crisis intervention, which is kind of what you're talking about, which is, a lot of hands-on stuff when things are
Mhm.
getting out of control. But a few of the teachers now that have taken the NVC process, they say that like that's like one of their number one tools in their pocket that they pull out now when they're in that kind of a
Mhm.
circumstance. Like they're using the processes of being able to hear in a certain way to be able to de-escalate, and not even having to move in to put hands on somebody.
Yeah. 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 I've done it behind a closed way door, where a student, I was a school social worker for a while. A student barricaded himself in a classroom, and I just listened to him behind the door,
Mhm.
and, asked him, and just was in the moment with him. And it was okay. We didn't need to call the police and break down the door. We were able to get him out. He just wanted to be heard. That's all he wanted.
Mhm.
Why do we make this so hard?
Oh gosh, it's such a good question. I mean, that's why I ended up going to get trained with Marshall Rosenberg, because I had a situation with a kid, one of my daughter's best friends kind of was going to be Baker acted. Here in Florida. It's called Baker acted, when
Yeah.
someone kind of goes,
Yeah.
she had a moment with her mother, and this was a very out of the ordinary experience, but she got very upset about something. I happened to run into her right in that moment, and I had the littlest knowledge of NVC at that moment. And I just brought her into my house and took her in my arms, and I just listened to her in the way that I had been trained. And I did that for about an hour, just holding her and listening, not doing anything else, but just listening for needs. In NVC, all conflict is a tragic expression of an unmet need. So what you're looking for and listening for are the needs underneath whatever is going on for a person. And it was amazing after an hour how much this young lady just totally became regrounded and wanted to know how to step back into the circumstance with her mom. And I remember having the exact same question that you just said. The next day I was driving around thinking to myself, dear God, is that all it took, was to listen in a certain way? Like, more than likely, she would have ended up at the hospital, or having to be called, the police to be called in. And well, look at all that was avoided just by someone knowing how to listen in a certain way. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So tell me what the plan is, if there is. Well, I know there is one, but I don't know how wide it is at this point. How are you getting this method to people? And I know that was one of your questions in the book. Did you get it answered for yourself in a way where you feel like you can get it into schools and juvenile detention centers? Like, how does one do this?
So yeah, my company is called the Bigby Method. Right now, we've